Hi, Renu. Good evening.
Hi, hi, good evening, Seema.
We'll just give it a minute, Renu, and then we'll start.
Sure.
Renu, hi. I don't want to keep you waiting, so we'll start. Hi, everyone. Renu, thank you very much, and please welcome and welcome to our guest lecture series. Everyone, it's my absolute pleasure and delight to introduce Renu to you all. Renu Narvekar, one of the most respected tax names in the industry. She's had a long and illustrious career, beginning with PNG 1990. Is that correct, Renu?
Yep.
Yes, she's worked with marquee names such as Stanchart, HSBC, and is now the global head of tax for TCS. There's a lot to say, but I think I'll just leave it here and hand over the floor to Renu to please enlighten us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Seema, and good evening to everyone. I think at the outset, I would like to thank Mukesh, Seema, and the tax bill team for this opportunity. As transfer pricing professionals would agree with me, there is never a dull moment in transfer pricing. And the spotlight now is on transfer pricing, and never before has TP been much more important to governments, taxpayers, and other stakeholders. So what I propose to cover in the next hour or so is transfer pricing as we know it today. Talk briefly about some of the key TP audit issues that I have encountered and some dispute resolutions to it. Then move on to BEPS, and then BEPS 2.2, which we know as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and then perhaps very briefly, if time permits, what the future of TP looks like. Okay. So to begin, what is transfer pricing? Okay. Now, very simplistically put, transfer price is the price at which one arm of a multinational group transacts with the other arm. So when one subsidiary of a corporation in one country sells goods, services, or know-how to another subsidiary in another country, the price charged for these goods or services is called the transfer price. All kinds of transactions within corporations are subject to transfer pricing, which will include raw materials, finished products, and also payments made for management fees, intellectual property, royalties, loans, interest on loans, payments for technical assistance and know-how, and other transactions. So if the two entities of the same group are located in two different tax jurisdictions, there arises an incentive within the group to set a price which could potentially reduce the tax cost at the group level. So the rules on transfer pricing require multinationals to conduct business between the affiliates and subsidiaries on an arm's length basis, which means that any transaction between two entities of the same multinational should be priced as if the transaction was conducted between two unrelated parties. The objective of transfer pricing is very simple. It is to prevent shifting of profits from one tax jurisdiction to another and ensure a fair apportionment of income of multinationals between the countries where the multinationals operate. So I would like to sum this up by a quote from the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeals in Aztec computer case, that is Aztec Software and Technology Services Limited. Quotation is ACIT 249 ITR A232. And to sum up, the concept of transfer pricing very interestingly has been put, and I quote, transfer pricing is not an exact science, evaluation of transactions through which the process of determination is carried. It is an art where mathematical certainty is indeed not possible and some approximation cannot be ruled out. Yet, it has to be shown that analysis was judicial and was done after taking into account all the relevant facts and circumstances of the case. So now let's look at when and why was transfer pricing introduced in India. So India opened up its economy in 1991 with the implementation of several reform policies encouraging foreign trade and foreign direct investment. This significantly increased transactions between the same group of companies, and the transfer price between them began to impact the profits and losses of Indian companies. So to address these concerns, India's tax authorities first introduced transfer pricing regulations through the Finance Act 2001 and made it effective from the financial year ending March 2002. These provisions were governed by the Income Tax Act 1961 and based on the transfer pricing guidelines of the OECD. The Indian transfer pricing laws are enumerated under sections 92 to 92F of the Indian Income Tax Act, and they cover intergroup cross-border transactions. Rules and regulations prescribe that income arising from international transactions or specified domestic transactions between associated enterprises should be computed using the arm's length principle. India's TP regulations describe various transfer pricing methods. They impose extensive annual transfer pricing documentation requirements and contain harsh penal provisions for non-compliance. The regulations also provide a detailed statutory framework for the computation of fair, reasonable, fair, and equitable profits and tax in India. The goal is to prevent the shifting of profits by manipulating prices charged or paid in international transactions, thereby eroding India's tax base. Now, since the introduction, transfer pricing has become one of the most international tax issues affecting multinationals operating in India. The transfer pricing regime in India, since its inception, has also been criticized for pronounced and protracted litigation. Now, this is because given the strict guidelines of the Indian TP regulations, companies are commonly subject to audits. And over the last 2 decades since the inception of transfer pricing audits in India have thrown up a number of issues and challenges. And like I said, I would talk through some of the prominent audit issues that continue to pose a challenge. So the first one is comparability analysis. Now, comparability analysis is the key to determining the arm's length price of an international transaction. However, given the increased market unpredictability and the increased complexity in international transactions, these have thrown up open serious challenges to comparability analysis and determination of the arm's length price. Use of contemporaneous data of comparable companies provides a more accurate arm's length price in a particular year. So accordingly, the Indian transfer pricing authorities, they gave the primacy of the data of the current year, that is the year under audit. However, the rules also provided an exception and permitted the use of data for the preceding 2 years if it was proved that such data could have an influence on the determination of the arm's length price. Now, this exception, it resulted in numerous disputes and protracted litigation between the taxpayers and the tax authorities. To put an end to such disputes and to provide the taxpayers a degree of flexibility to defend their transfer prices, the Indian government decided to permit the use of multiple year data. Thus, for transactions on or after 1st April 2014, that is assessment year 15-16, multiple year data of comparables can be used for the purpose of benchmarking international transactions with associate enterprise. The second challenge, audit challenge that we've seen is on location savings. Now, the concept of location savings, that is cost savings in a low-cost jurisdiction such as India, is one of the aspects taken into account while carrying out the comparability analysis during the TP audits. The expression location savings has a much broader meaning. It goes beyond the issue of relocating a business from a high-cost to a low-cost location and relates to any cost advantage that the jurisdiction can provide. Now, it's common that multinationals continuously search for options to lower their costs in order to increase their profits. In this respect, India provides various operational advantages to the multinationals, such as availability of low-cost labor, skilled employees, lower raw material cost, lower transaction cost, reasonably priced rental space, lower training cost, availability of infrastructure at a lower cost, and various direct and indirect tax incentives. So the main issue in transfer pricing is the quantification and allocation of these location savings amongst the associated enterprise. The next big challenge is intangibles. Now, the transfer pricing of intangibles has been a difficult area of work for tax administrations worldwide. Okay, and this situation is no different for the Indian tax administration. The pace of growth of the intangible economy has opened up new challenges to the arm's length price. Transactions involving international assets are difficult to evaluate for several reasons. Some of them being intangibles are rarely traded in the external market, and it is very difficult to find comparables in the public domain. Also, intangibles are often transferred bundled along with the tangible assets, and therefore they may be very difficult to detect. So a number of complications arise while dealing with intangibles. Some of the key issues revolve around determination of the arm's length rate of royalties, allocation of the cost of development of the market and brand in a country, remuneration for development of marketing and R&D intangibles, their use, transfer pricing of co-branding, etc. So looking at intangibles generated through R&D activities, which is another issue in the transfer pricing audits. Now, several global multinationals, they have established subsidiaries in India for research and development activities on a contract basis, obviously to take advantage of the large pool of skilled manpower, which is available at a lower cost. Now, these Indian subsidiaries are generally compensated on the basis of routine and low cost plus markups. Okay, the parent multinationals of these R&D centers, they justify the low cost plus markups on the ground that that is the parent multinational, they control all the risks and their subsidiaries or related parties are risk-free or limited risk-bearing entities. Now, during the transfer pricing audits of certain contract R&Ds, it was found that the Indian subsidiaries were not really risk-free entities, but they actually bore economically significant risks. Accordingly, such Indian subsidiaries would be entitled to an appropriate return for their functions, including strategic decision-making, monitoring R&D activities, use of their tangible and intangible assets, and exercising control over the risks. So in view of these facts, a routine and a low cost plus compensation model would never give you the right result in terms of the arm's length price. Then we also have marketing intangibles. Now, transfer pricing aspects of marketing intangibles again have been a focus area for the Indian transfer pricing administration. The issue is particularly relevant to India, given its unique market specific characteristics such as location advantages, market accessibility, large customer base, market premium, spending power of Indian customers, etc. The Indian market has witnessed substantial marketing activities by the subsidiaries and related parties of the M&M groups in the recent past, which have obviously resulted in creation of local marketing intangibles. The functions carried out by Indian subsidiaries of a multinational group relating to, say, marketing, market research, and market development, including adding value to intangibles such as brands, trademarks, and trade names owned by parent companies, as well as creation and development of marketing intangibles like customer lists and dealer networks. They have been the subject matter of transfer pricing adjustments in India. The expenditure incurred on these marketing functions has been considered for adjustment by Indian tax authorities on the premise that the Indian taxpayers were incurring these expenses for and on behalf of their parent companies outside India, and that these expenses promoted the brands, trademarks that were legally owned by the foreign parent AEs, and that these expenditures created or developed marketing intangibles in the form of brands, trademarks, customer lists, dealer distribution channels, etc., even though the Indian company may have had no ownership rights in these intangibles. So based on this premise, it has been held by the Indian tax authorities that the functions carried out, which are in the nature of development of the relevant intangibles, obviously deserve compensation. The next big audit issue that comes up during the transfer pricing audits is on intragroup services. Now, the globalization and the drive to achieve efficiencies within multinational groups have encouraged sharing of resources to provide support to group entities in one or more locations by way of what we call shared services. So some of the services are relatively straightforward in nature, such as marketing, advertisement, trading, management, consulting, etc. However, there may be other more complex services that can be provided either on a standalone basis or maybe as part of a package. And they are linked one way or the other to the supply of goods or services or even intangible assets. Now, identification of the services requiring an arm's length remuneration is one of the key challenges for the transfer pricing administration. As you would know, India believes that shareholder services, duplicate services, and incidental benefits from group services do not generally give rise to intergroup services requiring an arm's length remuneration. However, to reach such a conclusion, it would need a great deal of analysis. The biggest challenge in determination of the arm's length price is the allocation of cost by using allocation keys. And like we know, the nature of allocation keys generally varies with the nature of the services. Another challenge in the within the intergroup services is the identification of pass-through costs on which markups should either not be paid, that is, if the Indian entity is a recipient of such services, or not received if the Indian entity is a service provider. Now, wherever a markup is to be paid or received, the determination of an arm's length markup is also a challenge. So, given all the above, I think transfer pricing of intergroup services is considered a high-risk area in India. India considers payment of such intergroup services to be base eroding in nature, and accordingly attaches great importance to the transfer pricing of such payments. The last but not the least, another key audit adjustment that normally comes about is on account of financial transactions. Now, the Indian Transfer Pricing Administration has come across cases of outbound transactions where the Indian parent has advanced to its AEs in a foreign jurisdiction interest-free loans or loans either at LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Offered Rate, or at Euribor, which is the Euro Interbank Offered Rate. The main issue in such cases is the benchmarking of these loan transactions to arrive at the arm's length pricing of the rates of the interest applicable on such loans. Another issue in financial transactions is the credit guarantee fees. Now, with the increase in outbound investments, there are cases of corporate guarantees extended again by Indian parents to their associate entities abroad, where the Indian parent acts as a guarantor, agrees to pay the entire amount due on a loan instrument on default by the borrower. Now, this guarantee obviously helps the associated entity of the Indian parent to secure a loan from the bank. In most cases, interest rate quotes and guarantee rate quotes, they are available from banking companies. They are taken as the benchmark rate to arrive at the arm's length price. The Indian Tax Administration also uses the interest rate prevalent in the rupee bond markets in India for different for bonds of different credit ratings. Okay? The difference in the credit ratings between the parent in India and the foreign subsidiary is taken into account, and the rate of interest specific to a credit rating of Indian bonds is also considered for determination of the arm's length price of such guarantees. So, having looked at some of the audit issues, let's look at what are the options for managing these transfer pricing adjustments or dispute resolution. So, obviously, when the price charged for goods or services sold between related parties is not in accordance with the arm's length principle, Article 9(1) of the OECD model authorizes the tax authorities to make primary adjustments to the transfer price. Now, this may trigger economic double taxation, as the same income may have already been subject to taxation in the hands of the related party in the other state. In order to mitigate economic double taxation, Article 9(2), it enables the other state to carry out a corresponding adjustment so that the allocation of profits between the two jurisdictions is consistent. Therefore, an effective operation of the corresponding adjustment provision is important for eliminating any economic double taxation in the case of a transfer pricing adjustment. However, neither the OECD model, nor the OECD commentary, nor the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, they specify any methodology for carrying out these corresponding adjustments. Article 9(2) only provides that the competent authorities shall consult each other if necessary to determine appropriate adjustments. Now, this bilateral consultation, especially for large amounts in dispute, it takes place only by way of a mutual agreement known as the MAP under Article 25. Now, it may be argued that the words "if necessary" in the second sentence of Article 2 would suggest that a contracting state may carry out a corresponding adjustment unilaterally as per the domestic law if there is no disagreement on the primary adjustment. However, the correctness of a primary adjustment made by the other state in most cases can only be verified by the contracting state by going through the audit that has been carried out by the former, which is possible only by way of a bilateral consultation. So, in practice, interaction between the competent authorities is usually necessary. The OECD commentary to Article 9 also stipulates that the corresponding adjustment should be given through bilateral measures if there's a dispute on the character and amount of the adjustment. So even though the OECD model under its scope, it covers both elimination of judicial and economic double taxation, the granting of relief with respect to the judicial double taxation is probably dealt with more favorably than the economic double taxation. So to elaborate, the judicial double taxation can be relieved under two stages. Firstly, under Article 23, that is where the tax paid in the source country, that is withholding taxes on dividends, interest, royalties, and so on, is given relief in the state of residence. And only in the case of dispute between the contracting state is relief sought by way of a MAP under Article 25. But under the present scheme of the OECD model, MAP is the only bilateral method available to deal with the economic double taxation, especially in respect of a transfer pricing adjustment. If you look at it, if we think about it from a tax policy perspective, there should ideally be a similar treatment for granting relief, whether it's judicial or it's economic double taxation. The differential relief mechanism not only acts against the neutrality principle of taxation, but it may also result in loss of economic efficiency. Therefore, ideally, there should also be a two-stage mechanism for granting relief in the case of in case of transfer pricing adjustment. That is, have a mechanism similar to Article 23 and a MAP under Article 25 as an additional mechanism. This is necessary given the fact that the key area of dispute in the arena of international corporate taxation relates to transfer pricing disputes. The Indian tax administration is aware of the problem of increasing transfer pricing disputes and also the impact it has on the investment climate in India. With a view to reducing these transfer pricing disputes, a number of initiatives have been introduced in the recent past. So some of these include risk-based selection of cases for transfer pricing audit instead of selecting, all cases above a monetary limit on the value of the international transactions. Then we have the introduction of the range concept in the transfer pricing law, along with the use of the multiple year data that I spoke about earlier. Then we also had the introduction of safe harbor provisions by the Finance Act 2009. However, the operative rules came into play in September 2013. And then we have the use of the mutual agreement procedure MAP which I spoke about. And of course, the introduction of the Advanced Pricing Agreement Program, the APA program as we call it, via the Finance Act 2012. And this was done through the insertion of sections 92CC and 92CD in the Income Tax Act 1961. So the APA, as the name suggests, it's a agreement between the tax authorities and the taxpayer that determines in advance what would be the most appropriate transfer pricing methodology or the arm's length price for the cover intercompany international transactions. The Indian TP regulations, they provide the option for unilateral, bilateral, multilateral APAs. And rollback provisions have also been introduced in the regulations, and taxpayers now have an option to exercise rollback provisions for up to 4 financial years preceding the first year cover under the APA. So due to these initiatives, there has been an impact on the number of cases under audit, as well as the number of disputes arising from such audits, both of which fortunately have been showing a downward trend. So the tax administration now, that's the good news. The bad news is that the transfer pricing administration can now focus on high risk cases and therefore hopefully also raise the quality of the transfer pricing audits. So from here, I'll move on to BEPS and the background for BEPS. So the transfer pricing rules and regulations around the world, they continue to grow in number and complexity. We as professionals need to have current knowledge of a complex web of jurisdictional tax laws, regulations, rulings, methods, and requirements. The last few years have seen several tax controversies across the world, specifically in relation to large multinational corporations being seen as not paying their fair share of taxes, that is either by shifting their base to, say, low or nil tax jurisdictions or by means of aggressive tax planning. Now, this has resulted in the global political leadership under the aegis of G20 and the OECD, taking note of what is called base erosion and profit shifting techniques and stepping up to the task of trying to plug them. The base erosion and profit shifting project called BEPS, initiated by the OECD, it was a direct outcome of these concerns. In many ways, BEPS represented the single most important multilateral initiative in the field of international tax in recent times. The objective of this project was to revise the prevailing international tax rules so as to eliminate gaps and mismatches that enable the erosion of tax bases through artificial means and shifting of profits to no or low tax jurisdictions. So BEPS is a tax planning strategy that is used by multinationals to shift their profits from high tax jurisdiction to a low or no tax jurisdiction. And basically companies, they were eroding the tax base through deductible payments such as interest, royalties, which is undoubtedly an unfair practice. So let's try and understand the difference between base erosion and profit shifting. Coming to base erosion. Base erosion refers to the practice of reducing the taxable base. So let's take an example. Say there's a German company and there's a Netherlands company, and both are a part of a group of companies. The German company operates, say, restaurants in Germany. It's loss making and it does not pay any corporate tax. The company Netherlands, say, also operates restaurants in Netherlands. It's highly profitable and it pays corporate tax. Now, even though the Netherlands company has enough cash reserves, the German company grants them a loan with an interest rate which is higher than the market interest rate. So what happens? The Netherlands company claims the interest expense on the loan as a tax deductible expense, thereby reducing its taxable base and therefore the corporate tax payable by it. The German company includes the interest income in its taxable base, which obviously increases the taxable base, but it does not result in any payment of the corporate tax because anyway it's loss making. So on a balance, by this one simple loan transaction, this has reduced the total bill of the group in both in Netherlands and in Germany. So that was base erosion. What is profit shifting? Profit shifting refers to the practice of shifting taxable profits from a high tax jurisdiction to a low or no tax jurisdiction. Again, to give an example, let's say there's a company, ABC Inc., which grows a crop, say in Africa. It harvests, processes it, and then it transports and sells the finished product in the United States. Now, it has three subsidiaries. It has Africa Inc. in Africa. It has Cayman Islands in Cayman, which is a zero tax haven, and in USA, USA Inc. in the USA. Now, Africa Inc. sells the produce to Cayman Islands at an artificially low price. So what has Africa Inc. done? Africa Inc. has artificially low profits and therefore an artificially low bill in Africa. Cayman Islands, on the other hand, it sells the product to USA at a very high price, almost as high as the final retail price at which the USA Inc. sells the final product. So what has USA Inc. done? It has also artificially lowered its profit because the difference between the purchase price and the sell price is low. So therefore, there's an artificially low bill in the US also. On the other hand, what has happened in Caymans? Cayman Islands Inc. is very different. It has bought cheaply and it has sold at a very high price. Therefore, it has created very high artificial profits in Cayman. But because it is located in a tax haven, it pays no taxes on those profits. So this is what companies were actually doing. These are very simplistic examples, but this is exactly what companies were actually structuring their structures so to reduce their corporate tax bills. And transfer pricing regulation was named as a crucial tool in the battle against BEPS. This was followed by an action plan on BEPS published in July 2013, which like most of you would be aware, it included 15 action plans. But there were 4 action plans related to transfer pricing, which I would like to talk about specifically. These were action plans 8, 9, 10, and 13. Now, action 8 referred to intangibles, 9 referred to was on risks and capitals, 10 was other high risk transactions, and these action plans were aimed to assure that the transfer pricing outcomes are in line with value creation. The background of these actions was the view that OECD and G20 both felt that the existing transfer pricing guidance could result in outcomes that did not align operational profits with the economic activities which generated them. So actions 8 to 10 place more emphasis on significant people functions and their relative functional contributions to key processes within the multinationals. So there's a clear shift in focus from the legal form to the economic reality of a transaction. In cases where the economically relevant characteristic of a transaction are inconsistent with the contractual terms, the actual transaction would be identified based on the actual conduct of the parties. Then we have action 13, which contains a 3-tiered standardized approach to transfer pricing documentation, including a minimum standard on country-by-country reporting. First, the guidance on transfer pricing documentation requires multinationals to provide tax administrations with high-level information regarding their global business operations and transfer pricing policies in a master file. Second, it requires that detailed transactional transfer pricing documentation be provided in what is called a local file specific to each country, identifying material related party transactions, the amounts involved in those transactions, and the company's analysis of the transfer pricing determinations that they have made. Third, large multinationals are required to file a country-by-country report, a CBCR as we know it as, that will provide annually and for each tax jurisdiction in which they do business, the amount of revenue, profit before income tax paid and accrued, and other indicators of the economic activities. So the CBCR will provide a clear overview of where profit, sales, employees, and assets are located, and where the taxes have been paid and accrued. Thus, This is a tool intended to allow tax administrations to perform high-level transfer pricing risk assessments or to evaluate other BEPS-related risks and to focus audit resources where they would be most effective. The magnitude of the BEPS development is something not seen before in the area of international tax. The BEPS action plans represent a fundamental change in international tax law. Accordingly, the transfer pricing rules and practices have also changed drastically. And I would just like to talk about probably three key changes, or let's say three impact of BEPS on transfer pricing. The first is value creation, which was the objective of BEPS in the first place. So the tax authorities more strictly assess now whether transfer pricing outcomes are in line with value creation. In other words, do the operational profits align with the economic activities which generate them? So again, let's take an example to explain this. Say we have an XYZ group which sells exclusive and frightfully expensive designer handbags. Okay, the group's headquarters are in France, and they take care of all the corporate functions. The group subsidiaries in most of the European countries, let's call them the EU companies, they run stores and they take care of all the local sales. The group also has a subsidiary in British Virgin Islands, BVI company, which is tax haven. And the BVI company owns all the intellectual property IP of the group, such as brands, names, designs, etc. The BVI company does not have any employees. It probably rents an office from an external service provider, has two local nominee directors, and is definitely not involved in either of the development, enhancement, maintenance, protection, and exploitation, that is the DEMPI of the IP. But BVI company has granted a license to the EU companies for the use of the IP. So what happens as a result of this? The EU companies will pay the BVI company an annual royalty fee and obviously claim this as a tax deductible expense, which will lower their taxable basis. BVI company does not pay any taxes on the royalty income because it's in the tax haven. So this kind of IP structuring was quite common for multinationals before BEPS. However, following the BEPS report on guidance on transfer pricing aspects of intangibles, also known as the intangibles report, the tax authorities now have much more, what I would say, ammunition to challenge these type of structures with the argument that the operational profits do not align with the economic activities which generate them. For example, it is now widely accepted that legal ownership as such is not enough to allocate revenues of intangible assets. In short, a legal owner of an intangible will only be entitled to all the profits derived from the exploitation of the intangible if he, in substance, performs and controls all of the functions related to the DEMPI of the intangible, provides all assets, including the funding necessary for the DEMPI of the intangible, and bears and controls all the risks related to the DEMPI of the intangible. Now, in case the specified functionality is not present, the tax authorities can make an adjustment. The second change that I see is on the compliance front. Now, the transfer pricing documentation and compliance requirements are now being implemented, or let's say it's being tightened in numerous jurisdictions globally, whereby mostly the OECD three-tiered standardized approach is followed. Now, while in theory, since many of the countries are following the guidance of Action 13 when updating their domestic TP legislation, the outcome should have ideally resulted in a greater cohesion and consistency, between the national tax regimes. However, in reality, On account of the differences in interpretations by individual countries, we are seeing inconsistencies which may result in more controversy and dispute. So, for example, some of the CBCR thresholds are in local currency, like in Australia and UK. The filing dates are different. Moreover, some countries have additional requirements as well. So, for example, some jurisdictions, they prefer local benchmark studies over regional ones. In some cases, tax authorities prefer to receive the documentation in local language, etc. So, consequence of these additional requirements and deviations from the main guidance add to the complexity of meeting compliance standards in a timely manner and increase the compliance burden and cost for multinationals. Another consequence is that tax authorities have secured fine access to a significant and valuable pool of transfer pricing data. And to analyze that pool of data, tax authorities are investing heavily in qualified data professionals and technology. Which brings me to the third change or impact of BEPS on TP, which is disputes. Now, fundamental changes and the rules being subject to different local interpretation will obviously create uncertainty for multinationals and in all likelihood lead to more controversy with tax authorities. In addition, the drive for increased transparency through automatic exchange of information will undoubtedly lead to more questions from tax authorities as they gain access to new sources of information, including the CBCR. So this in turn is likely to lead to more controversy. Also, when following the three-tier documentation approach, additional details will need to be provided, especially in the local files, which may reveal some inconsistencies in the implementation of the global policy. So all these enhanced transparency measures in combination with the new mandatory disclosure requirements will enable tax authorities to scrutinize the allocation of global profits within the multinationals. So while tax authorities have become even more sophisticated in their understanding of TP issues, these new measures, complemented by increased tax authority resources and new tools, they have made tax audits more difficult and prolonged. And unfortunately, it seems like this is a trend that is likely to continue. So now let's move on to BEPS 2.0. The OECD and the G20 BEPS project also identified, like I said, those 15 action plans. They also identified the tax challenges of the digitization of the economy, which was Action Plan 1 in the 2015 BEPS report. Now, according to Action Plan 1, the digitalization can not only aggravate the BEPS issues, but also raise a series of broader tax challenges. The challenges were acknowledged as going beyond BEPS, which were identified as relating to the question of how taxing rights on income generated from cross-border activities in the digital age should be allocated among jurisdictions. As many of you would have noticed over the past half a dozen years, a number of countries have implemented laws to account for the evolving digitized economy or Action Plan 1. Some examples include Australia's diverted profit tax. We have France's digital services tax. UK has the diverted profits tax, India's equalization levy, etc. So in fact, India was the first country to implement an equalization levy on the amount received or receivable by a non-resident for providing digital services. India has also introduced the concept of significant economic presence, the SEP, to amend the rules on profit attribution to a PV. Now, while all these laws seem broadly similar, each one is unique. Okay, these unilateral tax measures are definitely not the most effective way in overcoming the challenges of taxing the digital economy. So accordingly, the OECD and the Inclusive Framework have been working on this, and in October 2020, they published blueprints of what is known as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals. Subsequently, recently in June 2021, the finance ministers of the G7 countries, and later in July 21, the G20 countries agreed on a deal for the OECD Pillar 1 and the Pillar 2 proposal. Now, this agreement, it reiterates the commitment to reach an equitable solution on the allocation of taxing rights. So while the previous draft restricted taxation of digital services to what we call automated digital services and ADS and consumer-facing businesses, CFB, the G7 and the G20 agreement actually provides for allocation of taxing rights to market jurisdictions for the largest and the most profitable MNEs, having a profit margin in excess of 10%. So these proposals, like I said, they're simply known as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. The evolution of the OECD G20 BEPS project from securing political commitment to taking action in 2013 to the finalization of detailed actions to counter BEPS has ended the first phase of the OECD G20 projects, which is now commonly referred to as BEPS 1.0. Now, like I mentioned earlier, BEPS 1.0 had at its core the concept that taxing rights should be aligned with the place of value creation. The new international tax rules being developed within the two pillars are commonly referred to as BEPS 2.0. BEPS 2.0 aims to secure and sustain the international tax system and increase tax equity among the traditional as well as the digital businesses. The fundamental problem that is sought to be addressed by the blueprints is that the existing international tax rules, they rely on a nexus rule based on physical presence and a profit allocation rule based on arm's length principle. Whereas the digitalization of economy has created business models that can operate in a jurisdiction without physical presence. Okay, so Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, they seek to provide solutions to the challenges primarily posed by digitalization. Pillar 1 is designed to address the fact that digital service companies are not being subject to tax in the jurisdiction in which they offer their services, which is to say the market jurisdiction. So let me try and explain by an example. Say a company physically located in one country may offer a social media platform to users globally. Access to the platform is free, but the users must sign up by providing certain personal data and or answering specific questions. Now, a lot of us sign up to this without reading all the terms and conditions. We just sign up as I agree, right? So this social media company, it collects this valuable personal information from its users in countries all over the world, and then it sells that data to another company that uses it for marketing purposes. So the social media company does not have a physical presence in the vast majority of the countries in which its users are located, nor has it actually sold anything to its users. Yet, it is still able to generate profits through participation in each of the local jurisdictions. So that's Pillar 1. Pillar 2 of the BEPS 2 project addresses the development of global minimum tax rules with the objective of ensuring that global business income is subject to at least an agreed minimum rate of tax. In fact, you must have read that recently, in fact, as recent as on 8th October 2021, 136 of the 140 countries of the OECD framework on BEPS, which actually represent more than 90% of the global GDP, they have politically committed to potentially fundamental changes to the international corporate tax system. So under what has been agreed is under Pillar 1, a formulaic share of the consolidated profit of certain multinationals will be allocated to markets, that is where the sales arise. That is, Pillar 1 will apply to multinationals with profitability above 10% and a global turnover above 20 billion euros. The profit to be reallocated to markets will be calculated as 25% of the profit before tax in excess of the 10% of the revenue. So if I give a very simple example, let's say the consolidated revenue of a group is say 5,000. The profit after taking into all adjustments is 1,200. Now, the deemed residual profit for the entity would be 10% of the revenue, which is say 500. And the total residual profit, which will be the difference between the profit of 1,200 less the 10% profit which can be retained by the entity, which is 500. So 1,200 minus 500 would be the total residual profit. Now 25% of this, which is 700, right? So 25% of the 700, which is 175, that is what will be reallocated to all the market jurisdictions. Now, this is a very simplistic example, but that's in a sense just trying to convey how Pillar 1 will work. Under Pillar 2, which is also known as the GLOBE or the Global Anti-Base Erosion Proposal, a global minimum corporate rate of 15% is sought to be introduced. Now, the minimum tax rate would apply to companies with revenues over 750 million euros. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will introduce two very new and very considerable sets of changes to the international corporate tax system. This deal marks a shift in tax policy because it not only imposes a minimum corporate rate of tax rate, but it also forces companies to pay taxes where they operate, not just where they have their headquarters. So hopefully the world will be more global, at least in following the principles of taxation. This, of course, is a very formative and groundbreaking development in the space of tax policy. And now all the glazing will be on its implementation, which is the key to success. As next steps, countries are aiming to sign a multilateral convention during 2022 with effective implementation in 23. The OECD will develop model rules for bringing Pillar 2 into domestic legislation during 2022 and likely to be effective in 23. A very ambitious timeline, but definitely one that needs close tracking and monitoring. And conscious of the time, very briefly, I would like to conclude by sharing what I believe is the future of transfer pricing. So what does the changing landscape mean for the future of transfer pricing? How should these recent developments regarding multinationals transfer pricing policies how should these recent developments guide multinational transfer pricing policies as a whole? Will the adoption of BEPS 2.0, specifically the Pillar 1s and 2 as currently proposed, mean that transfer pricing will cease to exist? I seriously believe that transfer pricing is alive and well. Action 13 of BEPS 1.0, which deals with transfer pricing documentation and country-by-country reporting, is a law of the land. Companies must still maintain contemporaneous documentation. Multinationals still need to compute residual profits in accordance with the arm's length principle and document their positions as part of their current transfer pricing policy. The arm's length principle for pricing intercompany transactions has been the modus operandi even as the digital economy continues to take shape. The arm's length principle remains the gold standard when it comes to pricing transactions between related parties, as if they were independent parties on an open market. So no one can actually argue that even in the digital economy, there exists a unique complexity surrounding the pricing of certain transactions, such as the sale of hard to value intangibles between related parties. So it's not easy to find an alternative to the arm's length pricing. Moreover, the allocation of taxing rights is a fundamental of transfer pricing, right? And what is BEPS 2.0 trying to do? The BEPS 2.0 proposals are seeking a reallocation of taxing rights. That is, they're recognizing more rights to tax to the market jurisdiction. Now, this would obviously necessitate a revision in the nexus, that is in the definition of a permanent establishment, and also revisiting the transfer pricing rules. There would be a need to allocate more tax to the market jurisdictions through a formalistic approach, like I mentioned earlier. But obviously, this will be based in theory on the arm's length principle. So in short, this implies that we would actually see the coexistence of a mechanism for the taxation of income of the digital economy with the application of the current tax system for the rest of the economy. So it seems to indicate that the arm's length principle will continue to be the guiding principle for transfer pricing for tax purposes. So I think so much to look forward to, and definitely exciting and interesting times ahead for all tax professions. I hope you found this useful. Once again, thank you for this opportunity. Seema, back to you.
Thank you, Renu. This has been extremely insightful. Mukesh has conveyed his apologies. He's at a BW panel and he couldn't attend. We were looking forward to it. But anyway, but Renu, I had a question. I know we are kind of running late, but in your experience in all these years, how often does tax integrity come up as a boardroom issue? So, when companies go about creating these so-called subsidiaries and tax havens, doesn't somewhere tax integrity come into the play versus a company's vision and mission statement? Because integrity is usually core there, in most companies.
Absolutely. So, Seema, I would say tax now obviously has a seat at the boardroom, okay? And it's not just because of everything that's happened in the recent past, but I think what these companies were doing, they were actually making, if I may use, they were taking advantage of the loopholes in the tax laws, okay? So one might argue that what they were doing was not actually illegal because the tax laws sort of provided for these kind of structures. They were using it to their advantage. What now BEPS 2.0 or BEPS 1.0 is trying to do is trying to make the law in black and white so that they don't circumvent these provisions. So tax integrity is a major one. In fact, if you see, I think most of the defaulters are these big US multinationals. So I think it would not be fair to say that there is no tax integrity. But like I said, I mean, at the end of the day, multinationals want to reduce their costs. They want to optimize their tax expenditure. And therefore, they try to find ways of circumventing this.
Fair enough. The other thing I wanted to pick up, and if anybody has any questions, please raise your hands. We'll not take a lot of your very valuable time. But on this DEMPI concept that we discussed, I feel that the whole DEMPI discussion is really overrated because the OECD has not really defined what is adequate return for legal ownership. And if you were really going by transfer pricing strictly, then all elements of the DEMPI were being compensated on arm's length. So really, whatever is left as residual has to be attributed to the legal ownership, according to me. So I just feel that this whole DEMPI discussion is really overrated, and if somebody was really doing transfer pricing the way it is supposed to be done, then the residual actually belongs to legal ownership. And that was something, probably the OECD should have, in my view, given more.
Yeah. But I think, Seema, again, to be fair, I think this whole intangible thing is so abstract.
Absolutely.
So it becomes very difficult for the OECD to sort of, clarify each and every aspect of this. Now, so even if you break up the aspects of DEMPI, what is development? When does development start? What is maintenance? What is exploitation? So each of these, so the whole intangible area is so very abstract. I think it's going to take another study to deal with it.
Yeah, because that line. So, like for example, if I'm writing a book, I have conceptualized it, I have drawn up the index, I know exactly where the research needs to come from. And now, if I hire someone to do the research, what? It's a very routine return that I would attribute to that. I wouldn't say they've really developed my. So it's a very.
But again, I think I think a lot of multinationals are actually misusing it. Like I said, there were a lot of cases where they were actually the Indian subsidiaries were doing all of it, and only because the intellectual, if I may say so, they actually were developing their intellectual property, right? But it belonged, the legal ownership lied with the parent. So all the returns went to the parent. So I think that was what OECD and the others were trying to nip in the bud.
I mean, I would still think it's more tax havens because, like, even if you look at Indian back offices for the most part, the core technology still comes from the US, and then you're really developing on it. So,
yeah. So as far as back offices, I agree. But where you're actually subcontracting the entire development of the IP to India, just because India has a low cost labor, I think that's where the problem comes.
Okay, we can take an offline discussion about it because I still feel there also like the skeleton is still coming. You're just offshoring the research part according to, but anyway, that's a discussion for another.
It all depends on where the brains are.
Exactly. And the conceptualization, I think the
Correct.
conceptualization is
Correct.
underrated in this whole.
Correct. That's the synopsis, right? Where the brains are, where the concept, wherever it is. If it's in the US, so be it. If it's in India, so be it.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you very much, Renu. I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Renu. We deeply appreciate having you here and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Seema.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
fish market as a whole.